My name is Mabel, and I am 53 years old. I am sitting in the living room of the house I have called home for 28 years, watching my son Jason carry his new bride's suitcases up the stairs to what used to be my craft room. At 31, my boy finally found someone who makes him smile the way his father used to smile at me. Stephanie seems lovely with her bright eyes and warm laugh that fills these old walls with new energy. I spent weeks preparing their room, choosing fresh linens and painting the walls a soft blue that would welcome them home from their honeymoon. But there is something in the way Stephanie looks around this house, like she is measuring it, calculating something I cannot quite understand. Before I begin this story, let me know where you are watching from, and please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever opened your heart and home to someone you trusted completely. Now, let me tell you what happened in the house where I thought we would build beautiful memories together. The memories of this place wash over me like waves against the shore. I bought this colonial style home in 1996, 3 months after my husband Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack. Jason was only 6 then, clutching his teddy bear and asking when Daddy was coming home. The realtor showed us 12 different houses, but when we walked through this front door with its stained glass panels, Jason ran straight to the bay window in the living room and pressed his small hands against the glass. "That is where we make snow angels, Mommy," he said, pointing to the front yard. I knew then that this was where we belonged. 28 years of mortgage payments, of scraped knees kissed better in the kitchen of birthday parties, where neighborhood children tracked mud through the hardwood floors, I refinished myself. The house has 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a kitchen, large enough for the Thanksgiving dinners I hosted every year until Jason went away to college. Every June, I planted new roses in the front garden, and every fall, Jason and I raked leaves together, jumping in the piles we made beneath the old oak tree that shades the driveway. When Jason graduated from college with his business degree, he moved to the city, but came home every Sunday for pot roast and mashed potatoes. He brought girlfriends, occasionally nice girls who complimented my cooking and admired the family photos covering the mantelpiece. But none of them lasted until Stephanie walked into my kitchen 6 months ago, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of sunflowers. She was beautiful in an effortless way, with honey-colored hair and a smile that seemed genuine when she told me how much Jason talked about his mother. We spent that first evening looking through photo albums, and Stephanie laughed at the right moments when I showed her pictures of Jason's awkward teenage years. She asked thoughtful questions about my late husband, about how I managed to raise Jason alone, about the history of our little town. The engagement happened quickly after that, a romantic proposal at the beach where Jason and his father used to fish together. I cried happy tears when Jason called me, his voice shaking with excitement as he described how Stephanie said yes. We spent months planning their wedding, and I contributed $5,000 from my savings account money I had been setting aside for home repairs. But seeing my son so happy was worth every penny. They honeymooned in Hawaii for 2 weeks, and I used that time to transform the upstairs bedroom into a perfect space for newlyweds. I bought a new queen-size mattress, hung curtains that matched the comforter set Stephanie had admired at the department store, and even installed a small chandelier because she mentioned once that she loved romantic lighting. I wanted them to feel like this was their sanctuary, their special place to begin their married life. The day they returned, I prepared a welcome home dinner with all of Jason's favorite foods: roasted chicken with herbs from my garden green bean casserole, and the chocolate cake recipe his grandmother taught me before she died. Jason hugged me so tight when they walked through the door, spinning me around like he used to when he was little. "Thank you for everything, Mom," he whispered in my ear. Stephanie smiled and complimented the beautiful job I had done on their room, though I noticed she did not quite meet my eyes when she spoke. Those first few days felt like the beginning of something wonderful. We shared breakfast together each morning, and I told Stephanie stories about Jason's childhood while she sipped her coffee and nodded politely. She was quieter than I expected, often excusing herself to take phone calls or spending long periods unpacking in their room. But I attributed this to the adjustment period all new wives go through when joining a family. The changes started small, so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining things. On their third day home, I came downstairs to find that the family photographs on the side table had been moved. Not removed, just rearranged so that the wedding pictures Stephanie brought were more prominently displayed. When I mentioned it casually, she apologized and said she was just trying to make the space feel more like home for both of them. A few days later, I found her in the living room measuring the distance between the sofa and the coffee table with a tape measure. She explained that she was interested in interior design and was just getting a feel for the layout, but when I offered to show her the original blueprints I kept in my file cabinet, she quickly declined and changed the subject to something else entirely. The questions about the house began during our second week together. Stephanie asked casual things at first, like how long I had lived here and whether I had ever considered moving somewhere smaller. She wondered aloud about property values in the neighborhood, about the age of the roof and the heating system, about whether I had any plans for major renovations in the coming years. One evening, while Jason was working late at his new job, Stephanie and I sat in the kitchen having tea. She asked about my late husband's will, about how property ownership worked when one spouse died, about whether I had ever updated any legal documents since becoming a widow. Her questions felt innocent enough, but something in her tone made me uncomfortable, like she was gathering information for a specific purpose. Jason began acting differently, too. My son, who had always been open with me about everything, started avoiding my questions about their future plans. When I asked if they were thinking about buying their own place, eventually he became evasive and said they were still figuring things out. When I mentioned that I was happy to have them stay as long as they needed, he just nodded and looked away. I started noticing Stephanie talking quietly on her phone in the backyard, always stopping her conversations when I came outside to tend my roses. One afternoon, I heard her mention something about property rights and inheritance laws, but when she saw me, she quickly ended the call and came inside without explanation. The atmosphere during our family dinners grew tense. Stephanie began making suggestions about updating the house, about selling some of my older furniture to make room for more modern pieces. She talked about how much brighter the rooms would look with different paint colors, about how the hardwood floors would benefit from refinishing, about how the kitchen could use a complete renovation to bring it into the 21st century. Everything came to a head when Stephanie's parents came for their first visit. Harold and Patricia arrived in an expensive black sedan dressed like they were attending a business meeting rather than a family dinner. They walked through my house with appraising eyes, commenting on the crown molding, the original hardwood floors, the size of the rooms, and the mature landscaping outside. During dinner, Harold asked me pointed questions about my age, my health, my plans for retirement. He wondered whether managing such a large property was becoming difficult for someone in my position, whether I had considered the benefits of assisted living communities, whether I had adequate support systems in place for the future. His wife, Patricia, nodded along, adding comments about how challenging homeownership could be for elderly women living alone. The conversation felt like an interview, and I found myself defending choices I had never questioned before. I explained that I was perfectly capable of maintaining my home, that I had reliable neighbors and a good relationship with local contractors, that I had no intention of going anywhere. But they exchanged meaningful looks that made me feel like they knew something I did not. After they left, Jason approached me with what he called a practical suggestion. He thought I should consider downsizing, moving to a smaller place that would be easier to manage. He talked about how the house was really too big for one person, about how the maintenance costs would only increase as the property aged, about how I deserved to enjoy my golden years without the burden of homeownership. For the first time in my life, I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. The family meeting happened on a Tuesday evening while I was at my weekly book club. I came home to find Stephanie's parents, Jason and Stephanie, gathered around my dining room table with papers spread out in front of them. They looked up when I entered, and Harold quickly shuffled the documents into a manila folder. Stephanie announced that they had been discussing my future and had some ideas that might be helpful. She spoke in a tone that was meant to sound caring but felt condescending, like she was talking to a child who needed guidance. They had researched several lovely senior living communities in the area, places where I could have a maintenance-free lifestyle with built-in social activities and healthcare support. When I asked why they thought I needed such arrangements, Patricia explained that they were just being proactive. She had noticed that I seemed tired lately, that managing the house was clearly becoming overwhelming, that it would be irresponsible not to start planning for the inevitable changes that come with aging. I tried to speak to Jason privately, but Stephanie always seemed to appear whenever we started talking. When I finally cornered him in the kitchen, my son looked everywhere except at my face. He said he was only thinking about what was best for me, that he worried about me living alone in such a large house, that maybe it was time to consider other options. The manipulation became more obvious after that conversation. Stephanie began treating me like an invalid, offering to help with simple tasks I had been doing myself for decades. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets without asking, saying she was just trying to make things more accessible for me. She threw away items she considered outdated or unnecessary, always with an apologetic explanation about decluttering. My social life became restricted under the guise of protecting my well-being. When my friend Margaret called to invite me to lunch, Stephanie intercepted the call and explained that I was not feeling well enough for outings. When the ladies from my church group came by for our monthly meeting, Stephanie told them that the house was now a quiet space for a young couple starting their lives together. She began speaking for me in conversations, finishing my sentences or correcting things I said with a patronizing smile. If I mentioned plans I had made, she would gently redirect the conversation, suggesting that maybe I had forgotten or gotten confused about the details. Jason started looking at me with concern, as if he was seeing signs of decline that I could not recognize myself. The legal documents appeared gradually. First, Stephanie brought home information about power of attorney arrangements, explaining that it was just smart planning for anyone my age. Then came brochures about guardianship procedures, about how families could ensure that their elderly relatives were protected from making poor financial decisions. She arranged an appointment with a doctor I had never met, someone she said specialized in geriatric care. The appointment was supposedly for a routine checkup, but the questions focused on my memory, my decision-making abilities, my capacity to live independently. I realized afterward that Stephanie had spoken to this doctor before bringing me in. When I refused to sign any of the legal documents they kept presenting, Jason lost his patience for the first time in years. He accused me of being stubborn, of not trusting the family that loved me, of making things harder than they needed to be. He said that Stephanie was only trying to help, that her family had experience with these situations, that I was being unfair to everyone by refusing their guidance. The distance between my son and me grew wider each day, and I could see Stephanie's influence in every change in his behavior. She had convinced him that I was becoming a burden, that my independence was actually a form of selfishness, that any resistance to their plans proved I was no longer capable of making rational decisions. I will never forget the feeling of standing on my own front porch, unable to get into the house where I had lived for 28 years. I had gone to the grocery store that morning, making a mental list of ingredients for the pot roast dinner I planned to cook for Jason's birthday the following week. The trip took longer than usual because I ran into Mrs. Rodriguez at the store and we spent 20 minutes catching up on neighborhood news. When I pulled into my driveway at 3:30 that afternoon, I noticed immediately that something was different. The spare key I kept hidden under the decorative rock by the front steps was gone. I tried my house key in the front door lock, but it would not turn. They had changed the locks on my own house while I was buying groceries. My hands shook as I rang the doorbell, listening to the familiar chime that had welcomed visitors for decades. Stephanie answered the door with a cold expression I had never seen before. She did not invite me in or step aside to let me enter. Instead, she stood blocking the doorway like a security guard protecting valuable property. "This house legally belongs to our family now," she announced without any preamble or explanation. Her voice was matter-of-fact, like she was stating something as obvious as the weather. She told me that the previous ownership arrangement had been resolved and that I no longer had any claim to the property. I demanded to know what she was talking about, but she simply called for Jason to come to the door. My son appeared behind his wife, and for a moment I hoped he would fix this terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he avoided looking directly at me and spoke in a voice I barely recognized. "Mom, you transferred ownership of this house to me last month when you were having one of your confused episodes," he said. "You signed all the necessary papers, and we have everything properly documented with a lawyer. The house belongs to Stephanie's family now because we are married, and this was always meant to be their property." I stared at my son in disbelief. I had never signed any such papers. I had never had any confused episodes. I had never agreed to transfer ownership of anything to anyone. When I told them this, Stephanie produced a folder containing documents with my forged signature papers I had never seen before in my life. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I had ever experienced. My own son was standing there supporting this lie, this theft of everything I had worked for since his father died. He claimed that I was no longer mentally competent to remember my own decisions, that the family was just protecting me from myself, that this arrangement was what everyone had agreed was best. when I demanded to see the original deed to my house. Stephanie smirked and said that was none of my business anymore. She explained that elderly people often became confused about legal matters, that I should be grateful they were handling everything, so I did not have to worry about complicated property issues. The cruelest moment came when Jason looked me in the eyes for the first time that day and delivered the words that shattered my heart completely. "Mom, you raised me, but now it is time for me to choose my real family. Stephanie and her parents have shown me what a proper family looks like, and I need to put their needs first now. They gave me 24 hours to collect my personal belongings before I had to leave permanently." Stephanie handed me a list of items I was allowed to take, mostly clothing and a few photographs. Everything else, including furniture I had bought with my own money, kitchen items I had collected over decades, and garden tools I used to maintain the yard, would remain with the house. That first night, I slept in my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, crying until I had no tears left. I could not understand how the son I had raised with so much love could throw me away like garbage for people he had known less than a year. I felt like my entire life had been erased, like the woman who had worked 2 jobs to put Jason through college and sacrificed everything for his happiness had never existed at all. The next morning, I sat in that diner booth with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands and made the most important decision of my life. I was not going to disappear quietly. I was not going to let them steal my home and destroy my relationship with my son without a fight. If they wanted to play legal games, I would show them what real legal documentation looked like. I used my phone to search for attorneys who specialized in elder abuse and property disputes. The third law firm I called Martinez and Associates agreed to see me that same day. Eleanor Martinez listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who had heard similar tales before, taking detailed notes and asking specific questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation. Eleanor explained that what had happened to me was unfortunately common. There were criminal networks that specialized in targeting elderly homeowners, using manipulation, forged documents, and family members as accomplices to steal valuable property. She had handled dozens of cases involving fake power of attorney documents, forged signatures, and elaborate schemes designed to separate seniors from their assets. The investigation began immediately. Eleanor's team examined the documents Stephanie had shown me and quickly identified multiple signs of forgery. The signature was close, but not identical to my real handwriting. The notary stamp was from a person who had been out of state on the date the papers were supposedly signed. Most importantly, the documents had not been properly filed with the county clerk's office. Within 3 days, Eleanor uncovered the truth about Stephanie's family. Harold and Patricia had criminal records in 2 other states for real estate fraud targeting elderly victims. Their method was always the same: identify a vulnerable senior with valuable property, have their daughter seduce a male relative, then use forged documents and psychological manipulation to claim ownership of homes and other assets. Stephanie was not even her real name. Her actual name was Sandra Kowalski, and she had been married and divorced twice before targeting my son. The wedding ring she wore was a cheap replica, and the romantic story about how she and Jason met was completely fabricated. She had researched my family online, learned about our financial situation and property value, then engineered their meeting at the coffee shop where Jason went every morning. But I had something they had not counted on. The original deed to my house was safely stored in a safety deposit box at the bank, along with my will insurance papers and other important documents. I also had a second will that no one knew about, written and properly notarized 2 years earlier, when I started thinking about estate planning after turning 50. Eleanor filed an emergency motion with the court presenting evidence of the fraud and requesting immediate restoration of my property rights. She also filed criminal complaints against Harold, Patricia, and Sandra for elder abuse forgery and conspiracy to commit theft. The fake documents they had relied on crumbled under legal scrutiny. The most satisfying moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor for 15 years, provided photographs she had taken when she saw strangers changing the locks on my house. She had been suspicious about the activity and documented everything with her phone camera. Her pictures clearly showed Harold drilling out my original locks, while Patricia kept watch. Eleanor also discovered that I had unknowingly recorded key parts of the conversation when they threw me out of my house. My phone had been in my purse with a voice memo app accidentally activated, capturing Stephanie's admission that the house now belonged to her family and Jason's cruel words about choosing his real family. As the evidence mounted, cracks began appearing in their scheme. Sandra started arguing with Harold and Patricia about how they had handled the situation. Jason began questioning inconsistencies in their stories, especially when he learned that Sandra had lied about her background and previous marriages. The court issued an emergency restraining order requiring them to vacate my property immediately and return all keys and access to me. Sheriff's deputies served the papers on a Thursday morning while I waited across the street with Eleanor, watching justice finally begin to unfold. The moment I walked back through my front door with a police escort will remain one of the most powerful experiences of my entire life. Sheriff Deputy Williams handed me the keys that belonged to me, the keys to the house I had called home for nearly 3 decades. Everything looked exactly as I had left it that morning when I went grocery shopping, except now it felt like I was seeing my own life with completely new eyes. Sandra stood in my living room looking smaller and more desperate than I had ever imagined possible. Gone was the confident woman who had announced that my house belonged to her family. In her place was a frightened criminal who realized that her elaborate scheme had completely collapsed. When Deputy Williams read the court order requiring her to leave immediately, she tried one last manipulation attempt. She claimed that this was all a misunderstanding, that she really did love Jason, that the property transfer had been legitimate. But when Eleanor presented the real deed and the forensic analysis of the forged documents, Sandra's composure cracked completely. She admitted that the whole relationship had been planned from the beginning, that my house had been researched and targeted, that Jason had never been anything more than a means to an end. Harold and Patricia were already in custody by the time I returned home. Their arrest warrants revealed similar fraud schemes in Ohio and Pennsylvania, targeting elderly homeowners with valuable property. They had stolen over $600,000 in real estate from 8 different families, using the same tactics they had tried on me. The most heartbreaking moment came when Jason finally understood the full extent of how he had been manipulated. He sat on the front porch steps, where I had taught him to tie his shoes 25 years earlier, crying harder than I had seen him cry since his father's funeral. He apologized over and over, begging me to forgive him for choosing strangers over the mother who had sacrificed everything for him. I held my son while he sobbed, feeling the mixture of relief and sadness that comes with watching someone you love face the consequences of their choices. He had been a victim too targeted specifically because of his relationship with me, and manipulated with expert psychological tactics. But he had also said and done things that would take time and effort to heal. The legal aftermath moved quickly once the truth came out. Sandra pled guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a lighter sentence and cooperation with ongoing investigations into her family's criminal network. Jason filed for an emergency annulment of their marriage, which was granted within 2 weeks once the court learned about Sandra's fraudulent identity and criminal intent. The house felt different when I began living in it alone again. I spent days going through each room, removing any trace of Sandra's presence and reclaiming the spaces that had been contaminated by deception. I threw away the bedding from their room, painted over the walls she had touched, and replanted the garden areas where she had walked. My neighbors rallied around me in ways that restored my faith in community. Mrs. Rodriguez brought over homemade tamales and stayed for hours listening to the whole story and offering her own experiences with people who had tried to take advantage of her after her husband died. The Hendersons from across the street installed motion sensor lights around my property as a security measure. Even the mailman who had been delivering to our house for 12 years checked on me regularly to make sure I was safe. The local newspaper ran a story about my case as a warning to other elderly residents about property fraud schemes. The article described the tactics criminals use and the warning signs that family members and neighbors should watch for. I received dozens of phone calls from readers who had experienced similar attempts at manipulation or who wanted to thank me for speaking out. Jason moved back into his childhood bedroom, but our relationship required careful rebuilding. He attended counseling to understand how he had been manipulated and to work through the guilt of betraying me. We started having weekly dinners together, slowly reconstructing the trust that had been broken. He became fiercely protective of me, screening any new people who came into my life and researching the backgrounds of service providers who worked on the house. 6 months later, I sit in my backyard garden on a warm September evening watching the roses I replanted bloom in shades of pink and red that seem more vibrant than I remember. The legal battles are over, the criminals are in prison, and my house is mine again. But the real victory is not in the property or the money or the justice that was served. The real victory is in the wisdom I gained about the difference between being kind and being foolish, between trusting people and allowing them to take advantage of that trust. My relationship with Jason has grown stronger than it was before Sandra entered our lives. He learned lessons about judging character and recognizing manipulation that will serve him well for the rest of his life. More importantly, he learned that family is not just about DNA or legal documents or shared history. Real family is about people who stand by you when everything falls apart, who fight for you when you cannot fight for yourself, who choose you over and over again, even when it would be easier to walk away. The healing process taught me that forgiveness is not about pretending that betrayal never happened or excusing the people who hurt you. Forgiveness is about refusing to let other people's choices control your emotions for the rest of your life. I forgave Jason not because he deserved it immediately, but because carrying anger would have poisoned my own heart and prevented us from building something better together. Through my volunteer work with the county's Elder Protection Services, I have met dozens of other people who survived similar attacks on their independence and dignity. We support each other through the practical challenges and the emotional recovery that comes after having your life turned upside down by people you trusted. These new friendships have enriched my life in ways I never expected. Jason has found genuine love with Emma, a kindergarten teacher who adores children and brings homemade cookies when she visits. She treats me with the respect and affection of a daughter, and I can see in her eyes the same warmth that I remember from my own relationship with my late mother-in-law. Their relationship is built on honesty, shared values, and mutual respect, rather than manipulation and hidden agendas. The experience taught me that home is more than just a physical structure or a piece of property with your name on the deed. Home is where people who genuinely care about you feel welcomed and safe. Home is where your real history lives, where your authentic self is accepted and celebrated. Home is where love grows stronger during difficult times rather than disappearing when life gets complicated. I have also learned the importance of protecting yourself without becoming suspicious of everyone who enters your life. I keep my important documents secure. I verify the credentials of anyone who wants to provide services, and I maintain relationships with neighbors and friends who can recognize when something seems wrong. But I refuse to become isolated or paranoid because of what happened with Sandra and her family. The garden has become my favorite place for reflection and planning. While I tend the roses and plant new flowers each season, I think about the future I want to create rather than dwelling on the past I cannot change. I make plans for home improvements that will make me happy, for trips I want to take, for the ways I want to contribute to my community during the years I have ahead of me. There are still difficult days when I remember the feeling of standing locked out of my own house when I think about how close I came to losing everything I had worked for since my husband died. But those memories remind me of my own strength rather than making me feel like a victim. I stood up for myself when it mattered most. I fought back when people tried to take advantage of me. I refused to disappear quietly when they expected me to give up. The most important lesson I learned is that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is not holding on to something, but knowing when to let go and when to fight back. There is a difference between accepting help and allowing people to control you. There is a difference between being grateful for family and letting them walk all over you in the name of love. I have discovered that real strength comes not from avoiding all risks or trusting no one, but from developing the wisdom to recognize the difference between people who want to help you and people who want to help themselves to what you have. It comes from building a life so rich with genuine relationships and meaningful activities that no one person or scheme can destroy your sense of security and belonging. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if everyone around you is telling you that you are being unreasonable. Your intuition about people and situations is often more accurate than you realize, especially when you have lived long enough to recognize patterns of behavior and inconsistencies in stories. Now, as I watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples behind the house that is truly mine again, I feel a deep sense of peace that has nothing to do with property ownership and everything to do with self respect. I know who I am, I know what I have accomplished, and I know that I can handle whatever challenges life brings my way. Because at the end of the day, the real home you can never lose is the one you build inside yourself, constructed from your values, your relationships with people who genuinely care about you, and your confidence in your own ability to make good decisions and protect what matters most. And that home will always belong to you no matter what anyone else tries to claim. Have you or someone you love ever faced a situation where family members tried to manipulate or take advantage of you during a vulnerable time? Share your story in the comments below because your experience might help someone else recognize warning signs before it is too late. Please like this video if it reminded you of the importance of protecting yourself while still keeping your heart open to genuine love and support. Subscribe for more true stories about overcoming betrayal and finding strength you never knew you had. And share this with anyone who needs to hear that it is never too late to stand up for yourself and fight for what rightfully belongs to you. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your home, your dignity, and your right to make your own decisions are worth defending no matter how old you are or how much pressure others put on you to give up. May you always have the wisdom to know the difference between people who want to lift you up and people who want to tear you down, and may you never be afraid to choose yourself when it matters most.